Hello everyone. In this video, we will review the solution to Program 5.13, Drawing a Half Arrow. This program is found in the Xi book for CS 200 Computer Sciences Role in Industry. This is Linda Gaston, your instructor. So for this particular program, the goal is to print a half arrow that looks like this, based on the user input. So the user will give us the length of the arrow, the width of the arrow, and the width of the head of the arrow so that we can use our program to draw the half arrow. So, as you can see from this picture, the program outputs a downward facing arrow that's composed of a rectangle that's here and a right triangle that's here. So you want to modify the program to use a loop to output what we're going to call the arrow base. We'll call this the arrow base, and it will be using the height that the user will specify. Then we're going to modify the program to use a loop to output the arrow base of the width of the arrow base width. Then we're going to modify the program to use a loop to output an arrowhead of the width for the arrowhead. That's here. Then we're going to modify the program to only accept an arrowhead width that is larger than the arrow base width. So this is the arrow base, and we want the arrowhead to be wider than that. Okay. Now it says to use a loop to continue prompting the user for an arrowhead width until the value is larger than the arrow base width. And you'll see that in a moment. Let's talk about some concepts that will help you to understand the lab. The first concept is a couple of printing tricks. So you can print out a statement any number of times you want in Python by using a for loop with the keyword range in the statement. So to print a star 5 times, you would enter for I in range 5, print star. This statement will cause the code to iterate from 0 to 5, exclusive of 5, but you'll still get 5 stars because you're starting at 0. You can also use repetition, and in repetition we would print star times some variable. So if we had 5 in I, we would print star 5 times because it would be equivalent to print star times 5. Another concept you need to be familiar with is while loops. This is similar to the for loop that we've learned about. In the while loop, while something is true, you keep running the loop and exit as soon as the test is false. This is the structure. While some condition is true, colon, execute these statements. Here's a flowchart depiction of a while loop. Notice we test right at the start. If the condition is true, execute the body. If it's not, exit. And we continue looping until the condition is false. The condition is tested at the top. This is known as a pretest loop. If the condition is false at the beginning, the loop body will not execute at all. So be careful with the values that you use to test the condition. Here's an example of a while loop that counts from 0 to 20. So we start out with 0, and we do this while loop while I is less than or equal to 20 because we're starting at 0. We're going to print I, and we're going to add 1 to I. We can also do this with the for loop with the simple statement for I in range 20, print I. This will print I starting at 0 up to 20 but exclusive of 20, which will give you whatever is an I printed 20 times. There are some differences in the while loop versus the for loop. The while loop requires us to manage the loop variable I by initializing it to 0 before the loop and incrementing it at the bottom of the loop. The for loop does this automatically for us. So notice the difference here. We have to start out and initialize our variable and increment it. The for loop handles this for us. Be careful. The while loop statement is simple but powerful and dangerous and can cause many program errors, especially if you have an infinite loop like this. So we start out with I equals 0 and we're printing while I is less than or equal to 10. I will continue to print infinitely until your program crashes after it begins to use too many system resources, because we never change the value of I. Now let's talk about the solution to the lab. Here it is. So we're going to print enter arrow base height. That prompts the user to enter the arrow base height, and we put their entry in a variable called arrow base height. Remember, that's the rectangular part of the half arrow. Then we're going to prompt the user to enter the arrow base width. That's going to give us the width of the rectangular part of the arrow. Then we're going to prompt the user to enter the arrowhead width. And we're going to put that in a variable called arrowhead width. This is where we follow the instruction in the lab to continue looping until the user enters a width that is greater excuse me, than the arrow base width. I think this really isn't probably the best way to do it. You probably should tell the user to be sure to enter an arrowhead width that is greater than the arrow base width. But this is coded to what the Zybook instructions asked you to do. Finally, we'll draw the arrow base and the arrowhead. So notice how we're going to do this here. We're going to say while this variable I that we set to 0 is less than or equal to the arrow base height, that's the tall part of the arrow, we're going to print star times the arrow base width. So then we begin to print out the arrow base as tall as it's supposed to be, and using this statement as wide as it's supposed to be. And then we increment so that we don't print it higher than what the user has told us to do. Now we've got the arrow base, or the rectangular part of the half arrow, and then we're going to use this statement to draw the arrowhead. So we start out, we'll give I a value of the width of the arrowhead, and then we'll print while I is greater than or equal to 1. We'll have a while loop to print while I is greater than or equal to 1. We're going to print stars times I. So we start out printing the very first part of the arrowhead being the same number of stars as the width of the head, and then we progressively go smaller and smaller and smaller down to a point so that our arrowhead looks like this. So we, in the first part of the program, print the base. Then we start out in our loop for the head, printing it equal to the number of stars that the user told us that the arrow would be, and then we keep decrementing by 1 until we get down to the very bottom of the arrow. Okay, so let's get back to our slides where we need to be. All right, so notice that's where we start out with the width of the arrowhead. While I is greater than or equal to 1, we're going to keep printing and get progressively smaller by decrementing the stars. Now it's time to demonstrate the solution to this problem. So I am using Python Anywhere to complete the solution to the lab so that you can see the code and see your program running. To save time on the video, I've typed ahead. So As stated in the instructions, we're going to get the arrow base height from the user, the arrow base width from the user, and the arrow head width from the user, and put them in these variables: arrow base height, arrow base width, arrow head width. Lines 12 through 16 are created to handle the requirement to create a loop to only accept the arrow head width that is greater than the arrow base width. So we're going to use a while loop to do that. So we'll say while arrowhead width that we've gotten from the user is less than or equal to the arrow base width, print enter arrowhead width, and then we accept the arrowhead width. And we keep doing this until the user figures out that they've got to enter an arrowhead width that is greater than the arrow base width. Now notice this continues on while the arrowhead width is less than the arrow base width. The minute the user enters an arrowhead width that is greater, this loop ends and we begin to use that arrowhead width in our code. Next, in lines 18 through 22, we're going to draw the arrow base. We'll start out by initializing a variable called I that we're going to use to 0, and we're going to do this step while I is less than or equal to the arrow base height. So if we want to have an arrow base that's 7 stars tall, we're going to do this until I, starting at 0, is less than or equal to 7. So we're going to print star times the arrow base width. So this allows us to print the arrow base of the appropriate height and the appropriate width. We increment I to continue doing this until we reach the arrow base height as required by our user. Finally, in lines 24 through 28, we're going to draw our arrowhead. And as discussed, we're going to start out with I equal to the arrowhead width that we got from our user here on line 9. And we're going to print we're going to print stars while I is greater than or equal to 1. So we're going to start out with whatever width the user gave us for the arrowhead, and we're going to continue to print and decrement by 1 until it gets to 1. So if the user gave us an arrowhead width of 7, we would print the first 7 stars, then 6 stars, then 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 stars, and that would give us the half arrowhead shape that we need for this program. The final thing to do is to save the program and run it. Now, I made a mistake here. I did not save this program with a .py extension, so the Python interpreter doesn't know what to do with it. I am going to save it now with the .py extension, and then we'll see the Run button appear in Python Anywhere because our Python interpreter now knows what to do with this program. So let's run it. So our program's asking us to enter an arrow base height. Let's say we want our arrow to be 7 stars high, so we'll enter 7 here. It's asking us to enter an arrow base width. Let's say we want it to be 3 stars wide, so we'll enter 3 here. And it's asking us to enter an arrowhead width. So let's say we want to test our little while loop statement here. So we've already tested our input prompts. Okay. Let's say we want to test our while loop statement here to force the user to enter an arrowhead width that is greater than the arrow base width, and our arrow base width is 3. So let's say we enter a 2 here. Notice how it's prompting us to enter an arrowhead width. It will continue to do that until we finally figure out that we need an arrowhead width that's greater than the base. So let's say we put a 5 here. Now our program runs. So here are the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 stars for the base. And that's our code here that we used for our base. Then here is our arrowhead width. We start out printing 5, and then we keep decrementing to 4, to 3, to 2, to 1. So this concludes the solution for Lab 5.13. If you have any questions, please contact me by email and I'll be happy to go through this with you again.